Thank you very much, John.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. It's a joy to be back with you, and it is amazing. Week 5 already. It just is incredible. And thank you again for the reflections. I think they really encourage me that that some of these threads of this conversation are starting to come together for us in terms of seeing the connections right through the biblical text and some of the amazing ideas that are contained in that. And I just encourage you, keep hunting those ideas down and work on them. We are, as it's been said, looking at building together in the context of our conversation tonight. And weirdly, we're sort of jumping into chapter 3 of Nehemiah. Now, you'll see why once we get going. And then, you know, I know you guys are going to be coming on to Nehemiah later. So this'll maybe sort of feed into that, hopefully, but also inform other bits of it. So before we read Nehemiah, or at least part of Nehemiah 3, many of you will know the context, but just in case you don't, Israel has by now in its totality been exiled. So some of you will know that after Solomon's reign, his son Rehoboam became king. Then Rehoboam the nation was already creaking under the pressure of some of Solomon's terrible policies, if we're going to be absolutely frank. The wisest king on earth, by the end of his life, was making catastrophic decisions that actually sowed the seeds of division within his own country. And that came to harvest under his son Rehoboam, and the nation split. And some of you will know 10 tribes went to the north. The capital became Samaria and was led by a man called Jeroboam. And then the south was Judah and Benjamin. Capital was Jerusalem, and that was led by Rehoboam. And from that moment on in the split, the north is known as Israel in the prophetic text. So if you read Kings and Chronicles or the prophets, and they're referring to Israel, they're referring to the north. And if you read of Judah, they're referring to the south. Now, fast forward a couple of hundred years, and the behavior of the north is so appalling in terms of idolatry that then God threatens and eventually allows the Assyrians to roll over the horizon and take them into exile. And the 10 northern tribes, in effect, disappear. And that is a catastrophic moment. If you read the biblical passage on it, it is really, really a horrific moment in Jewish history, and some terrible, terrible suffering. The Assyrians then, emboldened by that, head south, and they think they can take the southern part of Israel, which is known as Judah, surround Jerusalem, and of course there is this miraculous intervention by God, and they are spared. As a result of that, instead of then actually throwing themselves into God completely, they continue to be a little bit arrogant and distant with God. And this moment of deliverance, instead of helping them, almost nudges them towards further idolatry, which is incredible. And prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah, they're sort of talking into all of that. Eventually, the Assyrians are swallowed up by the Babylonians, and the Babylonians come rolling over the horizon, and they eventually swallow Judah. And if you want to read the tragic accounts of that, Jeremiah is your man. The end of Jeremiah is just, I mean, the pain of that is felt dramatically by Jeremiah. And of course, Lamentations, which is a lament for the fall of Jerusalem. So they are then carried away to Babylon, and you've got stories of people like Daniel in that context. And then a 70-year exile begins. And then the Babylonians are swallowed up by the Persians. It's a story of superpowers. The Babylonians are swallowed up by the Persians, and that's where Nehemiah comes in. So Nehemiah is cupbearer to the Persian king. So we are right at the end of the exilic period, the 70 years, and Nehemiah hears of the terrible condition that Jerusalem especially is in. He calls out to God, God shows him favor, and long story short, he's allowed to return to Jerusalem and begin some sort of rebuilding process. And if you read the book of Nehemiah along with Ezra, you get not only a rebuilding of the wall, but a rebuilding of the temple system. And so you get social institution rebuilt with spiritual institution at the same time. So that's the sort of overview. Now, I say all of that takes us to chapters 1 and 2 of Nehemiah. Nehemiah then does a recce of the city, and he eventually calls the leaders together and says, come on, we need to rebuild these walls. And then you have Nehemiah chapter 3, which is the sort of beginning of the wall building process. All right. So sorry for that long introduction, but it really will help to understand how Nehemiah thinks and some of the little clues in the text. So Nehemiah chapter 3, and I'm just going to read the first 2 verses. Now, you can read all 32 verses for yourself, and maybe you already have. And if you have read this chapter, you'll know there's a bit of a pattern. There's a repeating rhythmic pattern in the text. Even in English, you can hear it. You can hear the rhythm. We're going to talk about that rhythm in just a moment. And it says this, Nehemiah chapter 3, verse 1. Then Eliashib the high priest rose up with his brethren, the priests, and they built. In fact, they rebuilt the sheep gate. They dedicated it and set its doors in place, building as far as the Tower of the 100, which they dedicated, and as far as the Tower of Hananiah. The men of Jericho built the adjoining section, and Zaccur, son of Imri, built next to them. Okay, now I'll leave it there because there's enough, believe it or not, in that little introduction that will help us. So the story of Nehemiah is remarkable for a number of reasons. The primary reason for our thinking tonight is that Jerusalem has been in ruin for approximately 70 plus years at this point. And yet the text of Nehemiah tells us that Nehemiah returns, and within 52 days of starting rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem, the wall is completely rebuilt. Now, that is just by anybody's standards, that is remarkable, okay? And if you've ever done any DIY around your house, to do anything in 52 days is remarkable, but to build the wall of a city in 52 days that has remained broken down for over 2 generations of people is absolutely incredible. And I am interested to know what's going on there that enabled Nehemiah to motivate a group of people to do something in 52 days that nobody actually thought was possible to do. A wall that has been in rubble for over 70 years gets rebuilt in a month and a half. Think about that. It's just absolutely incredible. So we can read over these facts very, very quickly, but that's a staggering idea for me. So as a leader, as a teacher, I just go, wow, that is simply incredible. And how did he do that? How did Nehemiah achieve this? Well, ironically and wonderfully, chapter 3 gives us some serious insight. And it's clear that Nehemiah is a man of process. He's a man with a clear vision. He's also a man who's into detail. So one of the things we notice in Nehemiah is detail, detail, detail. He gives us serious numbers. He gives us insight into how many people returned. We'll talk about that in a moment. He tells us names of people who were on the wall. He tells us exactly what was raised in the offerings. He's a man of detail. I like Nehemiah because he doesn't sort of guess at the numbers. He gives us real insight. And ironically and wonderfully, it's because of his insight into the numbers that we get some powerful reflections on building together, and maybe some interesting reflections that we actually see. So here's the first reflection I want you to see in the context of building together. So we're going to assume that Nehemiah has done sort of what we talked about last week. So in chapter 2, he does this 3-day recce round the walls. He then pulls leaders together and he says to them, look, you can see the mess we're in. Come, let us arise and build the wall, rebuild this great city of ours. So that's the vision that he puts to them. And then chapter 3 starts to show us something of the mechanics of that. And I want to try and put some of that together for you. So here's the first idea I want you to see from Nehemiah chapter 3. Nehemiah teaches us that when we are building something together, it's not about how many people we have, it's about how well those people build. Okay, now, Pat hinted at this earlier on, which you talked about the bricks and the people coming together and making the bricks together. And actually, sometimes it's the way we do something and the project that we can invest ourselves in that is more important than how many people are actually involved. Now, we often talk about Nehemiah rebuilding the wall. Interestingly, there's not a single example of Nehemiah lifting a brick in the whole book of Nehemiah. So he's clearly leading the process and not necessarily physically building, although he may well have made that contribution. But it feels to me and seems to me like Nehemiah is almost the overseer, the shepherd, the apostolic figure that's sort of watching over this immense project, and he's helping others to find their place on the wall and to build. Well, one of the things, the other thing that we think about, because we talk about Nehemiah building the wall, the other thing that many wonderful readers of this text will assume is that somehow everybody was involved. And actually what the text suggests is actually it's a small minority of people that are actually rebuilding the wall. And it seems like the vast majority of people who returned after the exile have not got involved. And again, I'll show you that in just a moment. So what does Nehemiah show us? Well, he shows us that it's not how many when it comes to building together, but it's how well. Okay, now let me show you this from Nehemiah chapter 3. I don't know if you've read the chapter, but if you do take the time to read the chapter, one of the interesting things to do is mark or underline or highlight every time it mentions an individual. And in Nehemiah chapter 3, there are 37 individuals mentioned. Okay, now again, you can check that out for yourself, but that's there for you. So Nehemiah names 37 people. The second thing to notice is that as well as individuals who are mentioned, there are also groups of people. Now, what we mean by that is people who may have come from a particular locality to assist in the building of the wall. So, for example, you have references to things like men from Gibeon and Mizpah, and you've got residents of Zanoah and even Levites and priests who it says in chapter 7 returned to where they lived. So you've got then not just individuals mentioned, but you've also got, if you like, localities mentioned. The fact that people are coming to the wall from different areas other than Jerusalem, and that's an important idea that we will come back to. And then most strikingly in Nehemiah chapter 3, and you may have spotted this, depending on what translation you read, you may have spotted the rhythm of this. There is a definite connected rhythm in the reading of chapter 3, and you even pick it up in the reading of the English text. So for example, depending on what translation you have, you may have had phrases like after him, or beyond him, or beyond them is a phrase that's used in the text, and next to him or next to them. Now again, if you haven't read Nehemiah chapter 3, and you do take a moment to do that, underline every time you hear a phrase after him or them, or beyond him or them, or next to him or them. Now, in reality, what's happening in chapter 3 is that there are two dominant phrases that keep getting repeated, and they are powerful in the way you read the text, and they really do stand out. So, for example, the phrase after him or them, which is really a better translation, some English translations will have beyond him or them. It just essentially means if someone's standing here, then the person beyond that person is what they're referring to. That phrase is used 15 times in the text, all right, in chapter 3. The other phrase that stands out, and in the English is normally translated next to him or next to them, beautiful phrase. It actually comes, the root of the phrase comes from the idea of hand or right hand. And the idea is the person next to your hand is really the phrase here. It's beautiful. And that phrase, next to him or next to them, is also referenced 15 times. Now, remember last week when we did chapter 11, we looked at the symmetry of the number 1 and language and whole world, and the fact you get these repeat ideas. Now, the Hebrew text does this a lot. It's very, very clever. And the people who wrote it probably deliberately wrote it in this way to show us a dynamic symmetry in the text. Nearly all the references, with the exception of one, nearly all the references that have next to him or next to them are found in the first 15 chapters of chapter 3. One is found in a later verse, and all the references to after him or them or beyond him or them are found from verses 16 onwards. So you've almost got this, again, this symmetry. 15 times the reference to next to him or them, 15 times the reference to after him or beyond him or them. And you get this amazing symmetry, also almost mirror image in the chapter. The first 15 verses reflecting a next to dynamic, and the next 15, 16 verses referring to an after him or beyond him dynamic. Now, John, what's the point? Well, the point is this, that Nehemiah shows us that however many people were on the wall, and we might guess that it wasn't as many as we think, but however many people were on the wall, they were powerfully connected. All right, that's the point. So Nehemiah is not trying to show us how many people were on the wall in terms of here's the exact number. And that's really interesting because he gives us exact numbers everywhere else. But he's showing us rather that whoever was on the wall was connected. And it's a powerful idea in chapter 3. Next to him, next to them, next to him, next to them, next to him, after him, after them, after him, after them. You're getting this, if you read it and you read it out loud and try that in a modern translation, you will literally hear the rhythm of that idea. And what Nehemiah is saying, that the people who were on the wall were connected, next to, next to, next to, next to, after him, after them. And so what's being taught to us from Nehemiah, who really gives us detail when it comes to numbers, and yet he doesn't give us exact numbers in totality of the people who were on the wall. He gives us hints, the 37 individuals, the 12 groups of people that are there, but we're not given the exact numbers. But what we are given is connectedness. These people were connected. These people were working side by side. These people were working shoulder to shoulder. And again, you will hear the echo of the Genesis text in this context, where the woman is taken from the side of the man in terms of, or the formation of human community, in order to form a partnership side by side, in order to be a helper to the man, and so the man could be a helper to the woman. And there's the echo of next to and beside and after him. And the whole idea is trying to show us here is a community of people. We don't know exactly how many are on the wall, but what we do know is this: they were absolutely connected together. And when it comes to building together, this is an important idea for us as a Christian community, right where you are in your locality. When it comes to building together, we must not obsess on how many, we must focus on how well. Okay? If you focus on numbers, it will drive you crazy, because you will be drawn to who's on the wall, but you'll also be drawn to who's not on the wall, who's not building with you, and that is a distracting issue. At the end of the day, we have to focus. I remember the Lord speaking to me powerfully about this when I was pioneering our first church together. And it was a little church in West Yorkshire, halfway between Wakefield and Barnsley, little village called Havercroft. And the church had been in existence for a number of years. It had dwindled and closed. And then another church took it on. Royston Church, Royston Bethel Church, still going, still a strong church. And Royston took this church on and then reopened it and invited me as a 20-year-old Bible student to come and lead this church. Bless their hearts. And we started with 8 people. On my first Sunday morning, we grew to 13, including me. And that was what we started with there. And Zach Zachariah is doing a great job in that church right now. It's a different name, different church, but he's done an amazing job. They've got a beautiful building. It was incredible. But in my first year, I almost drove myself crazy because I found myself gravitating and speaking to and getting angry at the empty seats. I was annoyed at the people who weren't turning up, and ironically and terribly, I was scolding the people who were turning up because of the people who weren't turning up, and I got myself into a state, and the Holy Spirit spoke to me, and you know, I have to be careful when I'm recounting this because I don't want to be over familiar or sound like, you know, this is too casual. But it was like the Lord said to me, if you don't change your focus, you're going to kill the people you have and no one's going to come. And it was like a revelatory moment. From that moment on, I stopped. Now, please hear me carefully. I stopped worrying about who didn't turn up and I started investing into those who did. Now don't hear what I didn't say there. Okay, pastorally, we looked after people. But I made a decision that I said, we're going to build something. We've got to invest into the people who want to get on the wall and build. And so I started to do that without neglecting the wider community or those who weren't there. I focused my energy, and it was a transformational moment. I stopped worrying about how many, and I started focusing on how well. And if we focus on how well, the numbers aren't as important as we think they are. And I get desperately concerned. You know, when I go to leaders events and people say to you, how many people are in your church? As soon as they ask me that question, I switch off. To me, it is an irrelevant question in so many levels because the number doesn't mean anything. The number, a number can be made to say anything you want it to say. But actually, it's about how well that number is working together. It's whether that community is becoming a community of disciples, building something for the glory of God and building something together. That's more important than the number at the end of the day. Now, please, again, don't mishear me. Numbers are important. I understand that, and I'm not ignoring that. But an obsession with numbers, if Nehemiah had been obsessed with numbers here, he would not have built the wall. They wouldn't have got it done because he would have been focused on the people, not on the wall. Instead, he stopped worrying about the people who didn't want to build, and he started investing in the people who did want to build. And as a result, you get a next to, after him, after them, after him dynamic. Nehemiah ends up producing a focused, connected, synergistic group of people who achieve an amazing feat in just 52 days. And he's telling us it's not the numbers I want you to focus on because they may disappoint you. It's the fact that this group of people were connected. And it's back to that little echo of the Torah again, you know, that we've sort of reflected on before. 5 will chase 100, but 100 will chase 10,000. It's about the synergy of the numbers rather than the size of the number. Are you with me? Now, this is an important idea. It's about the synergy of the number rather than the size of the number. We get impressed by size. God is impressed by synergy. Okay, so he's not impressed by the fact there's lots of numbers. He's more impressed when those numbers start to work next to each other, side by side. And so I hope that makes sense for you. So the first big idea in chapter 3 is it's not how many. That's not really what Nehemiah is focusing on. He's actually giving us in the code here, the Hebrew text, it's how well those people connected together. Here's the second big idea, massive idea. that we see hidden in the text, hidden in plain sight, if you like. He says, it's not for us, it's for others. Now, this is a mind-blowing idea, but once you see it in this text, it just lights up. It is quite incredible. Now, remember, what are they rebuilding? Well, they're rebuilding the wall of the city of Jerusalem. But actually, if you read later on in Nehemiah chapter 7, verse 4, it'll tell you that there were no houses built at that time in Jerusalem, just a few. So there wasn't a huge population in the city itself because there was no wall. And where there's no wall, people are vulnerable. So it's not until the wall gets built that the city is going to be repopulated. And you get that sort of insight later on in chapter 7, right at the end of chapter 7, verse 73, it says that many of the people who were involved in building returned to their homes. The inference being they didn't even live in Jerusalem. And we see this repeated in the text. So we've got a couple of little clues that there's some people who are resident in Jerusalem. So verse 10 talks about Jedediah, who built next to his house. And then in verse 29, you've got the same reference to a man called Zadok. But then apart from those little references, everybody else who's building, the implication is most of them are not living in the city at the time of building the wall. They're living somewhere else or resident somewhere else. So in verse 2, you've got men of Jericho. Verse 5, people of Tekoa. Verse 7, people of Gibeon and Mizpah. Chapter 7, verse 4, the references to the fact that houses weren't built at that time, and many people after building returned to their home. So when you dig into the detail of the text, what you're discovering is this: a whole lot of people are building a wall for a city that they don't even live in. They're building that wall for someone or something else. Now, this is a remarkable idea because it drives again back to the visional dynamic that Nehemiah has instilled into these people. They are not simply building something for themselves. They are building something that has a vision beyond themselves and which is calling them to build something that some of them may eventually directly benefit from, and some of them will benefit from indirectly because the temple will get rebuilt, worship will be restored, and they'll benefit from that. But some of them are building something that they'll never directly get the benefit for, and that is a beautiful, beautiful idea. And it seems to me that Nehemiah is inspiring a group of people to do two things. And this is where it's very relevant to us as a Christian community. He's inspiring them to build for those who can't, and he's inspiring them to build for those who won't. Okay, now let me take them on one at a time. He's first of all inspiring them to build for those who can't. Let me take you to a beautiful expression in the Psalm, Psalm 102, verse 8, and it says this: "Let this be written for a future generation, that a people not yet created may praise the Lord." Now, what Nehemiah is instilling into them is this incredible generational idea that actually we're not just building for this moment and for the people of this moment, but we're building for those who cannot build, and even directly, not just those who are present at that moment, but the generations yet to come. We are actually building for them. And so he's instilling into them this idea that actually we need to come together and build for those who can't. Now, we'll come back to that idea to finish with in just a moment. But the second one is probably the more directly pertinent in the Nehemiah text. This really stands out. And it's this: he's inspiring a group of people to build for those who won't. Now, this is a hard one. And again, most people, when they read Nehemiah, don't spot this because we're rushing to the big glorious moments in the book of Nehemiah. But let me show you some references here which are quite incredible. Verse 5 of Nehemiah 3 says this: the next section, or next to him, was repaired by the men of Tekoa. But look at this: but their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors. Okay? So right there you've got a hint of the problem, that Nehemiah is facing a section of society that you would think everybody would be signing up to build this wall after 2 generations of it being broken down. And yet there's a section of this community that is refusing to put their shoulders to the work. Okay? So actually he's still managing to inspire the men of Tekoa to build something, even though the nobles of the men of Tekoa won't build themselves. Now that's an amazing idea. If you can get a person inspired to build when others around them are not inspired to build or not committed to building, that is, that's a real challenge of leadership and dynamic. The other little hint in chapter 3 is helped by a later references in chapter 7. Now, there's 2 major references in Nehemiah 7. One is about the numbers of the people who returned, and the other is about offerings. And I'm going to touch on both of those to show you the power of what Nehemiah achieved. In Nehemiah chapter 7, he gives us a detailed account of those who returned to Jerusalem after the exile, of which he was a part, of course. And he tells us in chapter 7, verses 66 onwards to 69, he tells us that 49,942 people returned. Now, isn't that cool? Now, I love that number. Do you know why I love that number? Because he doesn't round it up to 50,000. I mean, I love that. He's not evangelistic. He's given us the real number. Now 49,942. That means, this man's taking this really seriously. So we've got 49,942 people who have returned. When you then project that back to Nehemiah chapter 3, we're certainly not given the impression that 49,942 are on the wall rebuilding. In fact, by referencing just 37 individuals and just localized groups of people, and the emphasis on the connected words, the 30 connected phrases next to and after him, he is showing us that only a fraction of the 49,942 actually committed themselves to the building of the wall. In other words, he's reinforcing this idea that the people who are on the wall are rebuilding for those who won't. And that is a magnificent kingdom of God idea, that we are not just building for ourselves, but we are building not just for those who can't, the future generation, and we'll talk about those in a moment, but for those who won't build, those who go, I'm not getting my hands dirty, I'm not getting on the wall, I'm not doing this. What if we build the wall and it gets knocked down again? I'm not doing that. But Nehemiah inspires a group of people so much that they connect together next to and after him with these magnificent 30 connecting words, and that group of people build for those who won't. Amazing. So of the 49,942 who returned, only a fraction, it seems to me, without knowing the exact number, got on the wall and rebuilt. Interestingly, Nehemiah also gives us the exact number of animals that returned, 8,136. The man's obsessed with numbers. So there we are. It's all there. So we're building for those who won't. Now, here's the second idea. So you've got the men of Tekoa, their nobles didn't put their shoulders to the work. And that's sort of emphasized for us in that context. And then it says in chapter 7, verses 70 to 73, some of the heads of the families contributed. Now, that's referring to an offering that Nehemiah is raising in order to help finance everything that's going on in the city. And twice in Nehemiah chapter 7, it tells us that some of the heads of the families contributed. So the little subtext is a whole bunch of families didn't contribute. A whole bunch of heads of families said, we're not contributing to this offering. So within the context of comparing Nehemiah 3 to Nehemiah 7, which are sort of bookend chapters when it comes to the building of the wall, because the wall gets completed in chapter 6, that you've got this idea that some are not building, and the idea that, can I say this carefully, many, if not most, are not financially contributing. Now, there may be lots of reasons for that, but that's the reality here. You've got people not on the wall building, and you've got people not contributing, and yet Nehemiah still manages to do two things. Number one, synergize a group of people to build the wall in 52 days and raise a staggering amount of money. Now, let me show you how much money he raised. So in Nehemiah chapter 7, verses 70 to 72, it tells us, and this is now translating the sort of Hebrew measurement weights across to our modern weights. So there may be a little bit of movement on here, but we're in the ballpark on this stuff. So if you look at the amount of gold that was raised in the offering, it amounts to, or offerings, it amounts to 178.5 kilograms of gold, right? You can check that out for yourself, look at it. And they also raised 2.3 metric tons of silver. Now, there's a whole bunch of other stuff thrown in. I'm just focusing on the gold and the silver for you at this moment. Now, this afternoon, I went on the Gold and Silver Standard website to find out how much a kilogram of gold and how much a metric ton or kilogram of silver would be worth today. And here are the numbers. So today, if you and I in our New Life Eden raised an offering of 178.5 kilograms of gold, we would have raised £7 million. Okay, 7,386,000, give or take a few quid. All right, so it's an amazing amount of money. So in gold alone, by today's standards, they raise £7.3 million of offering. The silver amounts to £1.5 million. So in silver and gold, some of the people, right? In silver and gold, some of the people raised £8.8 million, according to today's standard, all right? Now that's incredible. Now these are details that are really easy to miss, because when we're looking at the wall, we're assuming everybody's building, and Nehemiah is telling us they're not, but those who are connected. And when we hear things like offerings in the Bible, we just assume everybody gives and everybody contributes. But Nehemiah is telling us only some of the families, heads of the families, contributed. So he's telling me and you by code, if we're listening, that actually he's managed, and I say he, but he's managed to pull off a miraculous reversal of fortune, assisted by the grace and power of God, of course. He manages to turn something round with a fraction of the returnees of the exile, and with a fraction of the people contributing to the offering. And he's showing us that if we can instill into people a mentality that it's not about how many, but it's about how well, and it's not just for us, but it's for others, it is amazing what can be achieved. Now let me just pause there. If you and I can then go back to last week, what you've got in Nehemiah is the very pure essence of what God originally intended, but which went south in chapter 11. In chapter 11 of Genesis, they synergize, they build, they come together, but they're doing it for all the wrong reasons. In the book of Nehemiah, they are synergizing, they are building, they are coming together for all the right reasons. And instead of that then sort of being messed with by God, the favor of God is blown on it, And we see incredible, exponential transformation taking place, where a relatively small group of people are making something happen by God's grace and by God's strength that doesn't look possible. When Nehemiah turned up at the beginning of this story, what he dreamed of doing looked impossible. And aside from the fact he's having to contend with not everybody wants to build and not everybody wants to give, he's also got a bunch of people who are trying to destroy him at the same time, enemies that are trying to destroy progress in Jerusalem. This is a remarkable achievement. And if you put Genesis 11 and Nehemiah side by side, you've got two building projects that one prospers because it's the right why, and it's a how, and it's a what that actually God can get involved in, and you've got a why that goes astray and God has to destroy. And so you can see what's capable here. That actually here in Nehemiah we've got one people with the same language speaking the same words. And they're speaking those words through their actions by literally getting their hands dirty and putting bricks on a wall, metaphorically or literally. And they're also putting their hands in their pocket and raising incredible offerings for them. But what Nehemiah is straining for us to know, and he wants us to get this, and that's why the detail is so important, is that this is a relative fraction of the people who actually return. Now, when Jerusalem gets rebuilt, everybody benefits, but not everybody built. When Jerusalem gets rebuilt, everybody, as it were, prospers from the restoration of the worship of the one true and living God, but not everybody contributed. And Nehemiah doesn't focus on those who don't contribute and on those who won't build, but instead he focuses on those who will contribute and who will build. And I think that's one of the key reasons why we never really see him getting angry and bitter, because he's focusing on the right things and he actually enables people to rebuild. Aren't they remarkable ideas just for us to think about? So there's a sense in which we read Nehemiah with a big sweep, and you get these lovely restoration motifs. The walls rebuilt, the temples rebuilt, worship is rebuilt, the Torah is read again in the center of Jerusalem. It's all marvelous, but the details are so important. And he's telling us that it's not how many, it's how well. He's telling us it's as it were, not just for us, it's for others. And here's the third idea, and I hinted at this within the context of the second idea. Here's the third one. I think he instills this in them, and I think this is bred into him. It's not just for today, but for tomorrow. Now, this is essential when it comes to building anything of significance. If our vision in building something is only about today, it will end up being a very small thing. But if our vision in building something for Jesus is with tomorrow in mind, then we can lay the foundations and build something that is truly, truly incredible. And Nehemiah, of course, would understand the importance of Jerusalem to a Jewish person. Jerusalem was their capital. Jerusalem was the city of David. David literally, with his men, conquered the city and made it his national capital when he united the tribes of Israel under his crown. But it also, of course, houses the temple, houses the very symbolic representation of the presence of the one true living God on earth. So Jerusalem is highly, highly important. One of the Psalms puts it like this. Psalm 46, it says, "There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her. She will not fall. God will help her at break of day." Now you can imagine that, remember, the Psalms, these poetry books would have, these scriptures would have been in some form or another in play by the time Nehemiah is around, and within it there is this emphasis that Jerusalem is the city of God. God lives in Jerusalem, and when Jerusalem is restored, then actually all is well with the world. And part of the drive to restore Jerusalem in Nehemiah's thinking was in bringing back the glory of God to that city, but so that that glory would be seen across the earth, and that glory would enrich future generations. Now, I am absolutely certain, I can't prove it, but in terms of the nuance of the Hebrew text, I'm absolutely certain that Nehemiah would have the echo of the words of the prophet Jeremiah in his mind, the prophet Isaiah. And in Isaiah 62, a great climactic moment in the prophet's pronouncements, he talks about the magnificence of Jerusalem. And here's what he says. Now, it's quite a long reading, but stay with me, and I'll read it. I just want to highlight a couple of very important things. Isaiah 62, verses 1 to 7. Listen to these amazing words. For Zion's sake, now Zion, of course, is one of the three main hills in Jerusalem, okay? So for Zion's sake, I will not keep silent. For Jerusalem's sake, I will not remain quiet till her vindication shines out like the dawn and her salvation like a blazing torch. Now remember, Isaiah is looking towards the exile, and he's now looking at a world after the exile. So the words of Isaiah 62 are words of what Israel, Jerusalem will look after the exile is over. In other words, the period that Nehemiah is now living in. He goes on to say this: the nations will see your vindication, and all kings your glory. And you will be called by a new name that the mouth of the Lord will bestow. You will be a crown of splendor. Now he's speaking of Jerusalem. You will be a crown of splendor in the Lord's hand, a royal diadem in the hand of your God. No longer will they call you deserted, okay, which it was when Nehemiah returned, nor your name, or name you land desolate, which it was when Nehemiah returned. But you will be called, and this is an interesting name within this, Hephzibah is the pronouncement. It's the name. Actually, this is the name of Manasseh's mother. Now, Manasseh was one of the most awful kings in the history of Israel. You'll read about that in 2 Kings 21. His mother's name is Hephzibah, okay? And that name is an absolutely gorgeous name. It means this: my delight, speaking of God, my delight is in her. So here's what he's saying of Jerusalem. You will be called, Jerusalem will be called Hephzibah. And what's God saying? That actually this desolate, deserted place will become my delight. I will delight in her, in the context of Jerusalem. And then he goes on to say, and your land, Beulah. Now there's a beautiful play on the word in Hebrew here. It doesn't come across in the English at all, which is a tragedy. But in the Hebrew text, Beulah, the root, verb root of this word, Beulah, is Balal, which means to marry. And so the land, so he's saying this, you will be called Hetzvah, which it speaks to the idea, I'll delight in you. And then it goes on to say, and the land will be called married or marry. And then you see the play on that in the context of the next few verses. It goes on to say this: for the Lord will take delight in you. There's the repeat of that, Hephzibah, and your land will be married. As the young man marries a young woman, so your sons will marry you. So as a bridegroom rejoices over his bride, so the Lord rejoices or delights over you. Do you see what happened there? So Hephzibah and Beulah, the idea of my delight is in you, and the land will be called married. God then picks this up, and he literally says of Jerusalem, I will delight in you, and it will be as if I will marry you, and your sons will marry you, and we will rejoice. And then he goes on to say this: I have posted a watchman on your walls, Jerusalem. They will never be silent day or night. You will call on the Lord, give yourselves no rest, and give him, that's the Lord, no rest, till he, the Lord, establishes Jerusalem and makes her the praise of the earth. Now, John, you think, what are you prattling on about? Well, the point is this. Nehemiah's motivation for building something was for the ultimate glory of God and the salvation of generations to come. Nehemiah understood how important Jerusalem was. He's not just building this as a good Jew who wants a city back. He's rebuilding Jerusalem because he understands this is where God wants to be. This is the city God wants to dwell in. And from this city, his glory will be seen across the nations of the earth. Give no rest until he establishes Jerusalem, until he makes her praise go across the whole earth. And I think that's the motivation of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is being motivated because he wants to see the glory of God return. He wants to build something in which God can live, and he wants to build something from which God's glory can be made manifest across the earth. It's a powerful idea. He's not just building because he needs a city to live in. He's not just building for today. Well, I need a house, let's build a city. No, that's where Genesis 11 and Nehemiah differ. In Genesis 11, they're building something for themselves. In Nehemiah, they're building something for the glory of God. They're building something for generations to come. They're building something for a people not yet born. They're building something so that the nations of the earth will see the glory of the Lord shine out from the epicenter of God's holy city, Jerusalem, and they will see the magnificence of that glory. That's the motivation that Nehemiah comes with. And that's the motivation he's trying to inspire people with. He's not just saying, hey, come on, we need a couple of houses built here. Who's going to give me a hand? He is calling them to the mandate of the prophets. He's calling them to the mandate of people like Isaiah, who talked about the glory of the Lord being resident and the glory of the Lord being seen. In other words, what's happening here is a powerful idea. He is lifting humans beyond the now. And one of the greatest challenges to building anything as a human is getting our eyes out of now, is getting our eyes beyond today. We are obsessed with today. We are obsessed with the moment we're in. We're obsessed with right now and satisfaction right now and happiness right now. And I want it all right now. And this is a broken idea that will only lead us to disillusionment and discouragement. People of the book, people of the biblical text are multi-generational people. They serve the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. They don't just serve the God of now. They serve the God of yesterday, they serve the God of today, and they serve the God of tomorrow. How does Jesus describe himself? As Alpha and Omega, beginning and end, Aleph and Tau, first and last. He doesn't just describe himself as the I am, he describes himself as the one who is, the one who was, and the one who is to come. The I amness of Jesus encompasses all the generations that we live in. And a people that drawn to that understand it's not just about today, it is about tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. Proverbs, I love Proverbs. I read Proverbs every day and meditate on it. And it's a beautiful proverb, and I've been reminded of it recently with the passing of my mother. It says this: a wise person stores up an inheritance for their children's children. Not just their children and not just themselves, but their children's children. Do you know, I have a granddaughter. I am already, because of that proverb, because of a multi-generational understanding, I'm already starting to store up an inheritance for her. Okay, I'm working every week to store up an inheritance, quite literally, to store up an inheritance for her, because I believe our mandate is not just to be consumed today. It's not just to think of ourselves. It's not just to be consumed in our own desires, but is to think about others and to think about the next generation and to think about what is to come. And I think that is massively, massively important. I love what Psalm 145 says. It says, great is the Lord and most worthy of praise. His greatness no one can fathom. One generation commends your works to another. They tell of your mighty deeds. Come on. And I believe that that Nehemiah is seeking to build something that will enable one generation to tell of the mighty deeds of God to another generation. And that's at the heart of our building. As a Christian community, we are not just building for ourselves, we're building for others. We're not just building for today, but we are building for tomorrow. My wife and I have been married almost 33 years, and pre-COVID, we used to try and go to European capitals as part of our anniversary. So we've had the privilege of just nipping around different beautiful cities of Europe over the last decade or so. And you know, we try to do it as bargain as possible and just have a great time. We love walking, and we've just had an amazing time. And a few years ago, we went to Prague, and Prague is just a magnificent city. And we went to Prague Cathedral. And that is just stunning. And as I was having the guided tour of Prague Cathedral, I discovered an amazing fact that actually from the first brick or foundation stone that was put in place in Prague Cathedral to the moment when it was eventually absolutely completed as a building, it took 800 years. Okay? Now think about that, 800 years. That's 16 generations of builders to build one building. So here's the thought that struck me in Prague Cathedral, that when the first builder put the first brick in place, he or she knew, I will never see this finished, but I will build it anyway. And you know what? Something lit up inside me in Prague Cathedral, and I went, Lord, that's how I want to live. I never want to be so selfish that I say, I'm only building something if I get something out of it. Or I'm only going to build something if I see it finished. Or I'm only going to build something if I get some sort of credit and glory for it. No. The builders who built Prague Cathedral, and I suppose that story could be replicated right across the earth in terms of great buildings. They knew that the minute they put that brick in the ground, actually, they would never see this thing finished. But they made their contribution anyway. That's the kingdom of God. That's what Nehemiah's about here. Nehemiah manages to see a wall completed, but he never sees the ultimate glory that will come to Jerusalem, of course, manifest magnificently in the incarnation when Jesus arrives at Jerusalem. Nehemiah never saw that, but he built a city that eventually facilitated the glory of God to be manifest and demonstrated across the earth. I love that. So Nehemiah speaks to us, and he talks to us about building together, and he reminds us of three incredible ideas in the midst of all this detail. Number one, it's not about how many, it is rather about how well. Those 30 connected words and phrases in chapter 3. He reminds us that it's not just for us we are building, but it's for others, for those who won't build, those who didn't get on the wall, those who didn't contribute to the offering, and those who can't build for one reason or another, and even a generation not yet born. And then he reminds us magnificently that we're not just building for today, but we are building for tomorrow. I believe, inspired by the great Psalms and inspired by the great prophetic words of the prophets, Nehemiah understands the world needs this city. Not just the inhabitants of the city, but the world needs this city. And if we build it well, then the world will benefit from it. And so when we look at Nehemiah, we see the power of building together. That a relatively small group of people, motivated by a glorious vision beyond themselves and organized effectively by an outstanding leader, can achieve something for the glory of God that actually is still celebrated almost 2,500 years later. We're still talking about that achievement. Contrast that to Genesis 11, where actually that great project ended in tragedy. because the motivation and the vision was about selfishness and ego and the desires of humans. Contrast that to Nehemiah, where the motivation and the vision was for the glory of God, and a group of people achieved something that we marvel at even today in a 21st century context. So I want to encourage you in your church, right where you are. It's not about how many, it's about how well. It's not just, about building for ourselves, but building for others. And we're not just thinking about today, but we're actually investing into tomorrow. And I believe that those three ideas can bring continuous inspiration to us as we seek to build together. Hope that makes sense to you. Hope it helps you. And I hope it blesses you. Thank you so much. Bless your hearts.